just like Phyllis Hyman, I do not believe that Whitney Houston had more than one vagina. I think Robin Crawford was her one and only vagina. Just like Martha is Phyllis Herman's one and only vagina.
I don't hear nobody out there. Hold it down. Hold it down.
As 1994 came to a close, Phyllis's brief relationship with William was waning, and her affair with Martha David was slowly rekindling. Martha, of course, had greater insight into Phyllis's sexual identity than most. Phyllis was very connected to men and mostly connected to men, she said. Early on in our relationship, she felt differently at different times, depending on how she was feeling about herself and the world, and in terms of her ups and downs psychologically. For someone who sees themselves as straight and wants to be straight, and has being straight so ingrained in who they are, to develop feelings for someone of the same sex is a hard thing to reconcile. Just sexual feelings alone can be threatening enough, though I don't think that they were for Phyllis, but beyond actual feelings especially. I had this shit right here. I don't even know what she's talking about. But remember when we read in the book, Phyllis took all her clothes off and was like, "Come here, you thing, you. Come lay me down and do whatever you gay women do." I think that could be one of the reasons why she resisted early on allowing herself to have and admit feelings for me. There were some times when she did feel more comfortable with the whole idea and what it meant in terms of herself. Unfortunately, I just sort of have to guess that as the relationship went on and her feelings remained and deepened, and as she began to trust me and my feelings more, she just figured forget the labels, and she went with it. It eventually didn't really matter to her. Back in New York, things between Phyllis and Martha grew more serious by the day. Near the end of January 1995, Martha reminded her that it had been 7 years since the two had first begun an intimate relationship. Girl, time be flying. For real. She said that ours was the longest relationship she'd ever had. And I said, well, of course, there were large breaks in it. And she said, but I've never continued to have the same feelings for a person for that long. I think that meant a lot to her as time went on, because I think that she really began to trust how much I loved her and could let herself go a little more with her own feelings, because feeling vulnerable is a big issue for everybody, but it was major for Phyllis. The couple decided to celebrate their anniversary on February 1st. Phyllis hired the car, and she and Martha planned an elaborate night on the town. They even decided to exchange rings. There was a ring of hers that was on the table, and I put it on. It was just a little copper ring, and she said we should get each other rings. She bought me a ring and gave it to me on our anniversary. Then we went out on Valentine's Day 2 weeks later, and she picked out a ring that I got for her then. After that, Martha never went home. Instead, she once again began living with Phyllis, who seemed more focused and more together than Martha ever remembered seeing her. Okay, so two things. The first thing is, just like Phyllis Hyman, I do not believe that Whitney Houston had more than one vagina. I think Robin Crawford was her one and only vagina. Just like Martha is Phyllis Herman's one and only vagina. The next thing is, people who just be so like pressed for relationships that they only happy in relationships. Like some people maneuver better in the universe inside of a relationship. But girl, don't maneuver like trash just because you're single. On Saturday, April 1st, a day that Martha recalls vividly, Phyllis was extremely irritable and in fact downright mean. I confronted her with it. Over the 7+ year period of knowing her, I had been increasing in my own psychological health and maturity, and I really wasn't going to stand for it. Good for you, girl. When I tell you I had to make that choice, I forgot when it was, but it was when I read that Mariah Carey book. Baby, that mother hunchy changed my life. I chose me. You got to put your foot down some way, somehow. Looking back on it and learning more about people who are manic depressive, I believe perhaps that she was then entering a new phase of that. I was trying to force her to discuss something on a rational level, but the turmoil within her was not coming from a rational place at all. But I insisted on talking about it, and she got very upset and angry, and I started to pack up my things. This is when Martha believes Phyllis began to misunderstand her motives. I was not planning on leaving her, but I had made up my mind to make some changes in our overall arrangement. I felt I needed to take myself back home and be based out of my own apartment, that I needed to be more in control of my environment. Yeah, so you don't kill it. Later, I realized she'd probably thought I was leaving her. She demanded at that point to have her keys back. It probably looked like I was leaving her completely, but not knowing that when she demanded her keys back, I took that as her saying, "Get out my life." I mean, I don't have time for people with their manicness. With Martha gone, Phyllis began spending more and more time alone in her apartment. 4 years after her last album, fewer dates than ever were coming in, and as she resumed touring, Phyllis was hardly recognizable to her audiences. Having piled on yet more weight during her recovery from the broken ankle. Home in New York, Phyllis didn't leave her apartment often, but Gordon Chambers was able to entice her out of seclusion from time to time. She was really looking sloppy, Gordon said. A lot of times I would see her and she just looked unattended to. Her clothes didn't really look quite clean. The last few times I went out with her, she wore the same outfit a couple of times during the same week. I kept thinking to myself, why isn't anyone taking care of her? Those closest to Phyllis say that she took something away from each of her 2 trips to rehab. She had been in and out of therapy for years and spent a good deal of time in sessions with Portia Hunt in Philadelphia. In her clear moments, Phyllis knew that no such night was coming for her, that only she could slay the demons she wrestled with. She also knew that her resources to fight such a battle were severely limited. Physically, financially, mentally, and emotionally, Phyllis was drained. The Internal Revenue Service was breathing down her neck once again. Her savings account was empty. She held no stocks or bonds she could cash in, no property she could mortgage. She was in debt to her record label and even still in debt to the label she had left a decade earlier. Her writers and publishing royalties generated little income and certainly not enough to borrow against. In short, Phyllis was flat broke. To save herself and her sanity, Phyllis would have to sacrifice all the things that represented being Phyllis Hyman to her. all the things she enjoyed. The stage was perhaps the one place in the world where she felt truly comfortable, and she would have to give it up, at least for a time. She knew that if Humpty Dumpty was ever going to be put back together again, she was going to have to change everything about her life, said Bill Schultz. And that was something she was unwilling to do, perhaps even unable to do. If Phyllis surrendered her pride and ego, what was left? The singing star, the celebrity, this was the one part of herself that Phyllis Hyman was sure of. So who would she be if she couldn't be that person? Yet even as Phyllis knew she could not give this portion of her life up, she realized she was losing it. At 45, and after spending more than 20 years in the business, Phyllis knew that she had peaked as a performer. This caused the resentment to grow and the bitterness to fester, which in turn manifested itself as unreliable behavior behind the scenes and ever-increasing outbursts of obscenities from the stage. Much as Phyllis used cocaine to stimulate or create the illusion of the high of the stage, her desperate attempts to take charge, her acting out were about maintaining the illusion of control. On Sunday, June 25th, 1995. Early in the week, she called Brenda Berry in Maryland and told her she was playing the Apollo on Friday and needed her to be there. "I'm not going to take no for an answer, girlfriend," she told her. "I want you to come." On Tuesday, June 27th, Glenda called Phyllis to check in and, more importantly, to report that Kenny Gamble had turned over the finished album to Zoo. Finally, it would seem Phyllis had something to look forward to. Her last two albums had fared well, and indications were that this one would too. "We had a routine business conversation," Glenda recalled. She seemed pretty happy. "We were talking about future dates, the status of things to come, what she needed for the Apollo performance. There was no hint of anything wrong." The show, Friday, June 30th, was supposed to have been Phyllis's final hurrah, but something happened to convince her to hasten her exit. Perhaps it was the fear that one of those lucky enough to receive a goodbye call would show up and try to stop her, or perhaps she was just truly too tired to get up on stage and give one more performance. Whatever the reason, Phyllis chose not to play the Apollo Theater one last time.
Hallelujah.